All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know folks will be joining along the way, but just want to honor everyone's time who has gotten on so far, and we want to dig in. We've got a lot to cover. So we thought we would do something a little different this year and provide a pre-election forecast. I fully expect that once all of the dust settles after the election, we will circle back and provide some updates on where things settled, where do we see things playing out. But we thought, just given the attention and how close we are to the election, we thought we might share some thoughts and some data, some information about how things are shaping up and, frankly, where we expect things to go. So let's jump in here and proceed. Here's the agenda. We've got a lot to cover. We'll do introductions. I'll spend a few minutes on sort of the national scene, but we want to spend a lot of time on the state political overview. So we'll talk about the state of the governor's races, chief state school officers, some interesting ballot measures, what's going on at the state legislative level, and then some district implications. And we'll also talk a few minutes about some of the trends, some of the topics that we're seeing being most important, that'll be most talked about, and be the policies and funding that we'll see the most of next year and after. And then we'll spend a few minutes at the end just talking about how you all can stay abreast of these developments and what you should be looking for, and frankly, how we can either continue to help you or potentially help you more in the future. So let's jump in. Quick intros. I'm sure we're all fairly familiar to you all, but I'm Doug Mescar. I'm a partner here at the Strategos Group. I lead the market intelligence and strategy practice, and I've been on the both public and private sector side. So I do a lot of translating of what all of this political and policy and funding mess means for you all. So, Johnny, do you want to do a quick intro, and then we'll just go right down the line?
Sure. Thank you, Doug. Johnny Key, up until last year, was the Secretary of Education for Arkansas, worked for Governor Asa Hutchinson, spent time in the Arkansas General Assembly in both the House and the Senate. I lead, along with Tom Luna, former State Superintendent of Idaho, our State Superintendent Engagement Practice, SSE, excuse me, where we engage, as it sounds, with state level decision makers at departments and of education, sometimes the governor's offices, and look forward to the conversation today.
Hey, good afternoon, Addison Davis. Also, I'm part of a team that drives the business transactional advisory, which is business development, working alongside Todd Lamb, who's a major partner in this work, and Jim Horn, former superintendent of Hillsborough County Public Schools, 7th largest district in the nation in Tampa 15 months ago, and then also superintendent in Clay County. Excited to be here to be able to dive in and talk about the district perspective related to our work and our journey in the pre-election side.
Hey everyone, Tara Reed Cherry. I lead the government affairs practice at Strategos Group, and I myself am based in Florida. So, doing the day-to-day lobbying here in the state.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks all. Well, as you can see, we've got former state chief, district superintendent, legislator, federal guy, campaign aide. So we're going to cover all those bases and more. So excited to dig in. So let's start with the national overview. I'm sure you're all aware we're 6 days away. Thank goodness. Let's get this thing over with. It seems like it's been ongoing forever, and just the intensity of focus on it has been incredible. As you can see here, this is an electoral college map. So kind of where are the swing states, who's expected to win what. You may all be very aware, we've got, what do we have? 7 states that are the quote battleground or swing states. And there are certain combinations of those, right? And I put that here. If former President Trump wins, a certain group of these states, then, that is his path to victory. If Vice President Harris wins a sort of different set of states, although Pennsylvania in common there, then that's her path to victory. I mean, this thing is just too close to call, right? If you look at the polling nationally as well as in the swing states, the interesting thing to me is that this is going to come down to the independents, which now make up the largest sort of group in our electorate. And they're, in terms of likely voters, you can see on my last bullet point there, um, they're younger. They tend to be less ideological. They tend to be more worried about the economy, and it's going to all come down to that and turnout. So I think everyone thinks it's a race that's too close to call, and frankly we may not know right away, which is what gives me a little pause for some concern, is how long will this take to actually declare a winner. But this obviously will mean a lot in terms of not only the direction of the country, but the direction of education policy nationally, but also the signal it sends across the country. Let me just pause here. I don't need to belabor this slide because I think everyone's probably pretty up to speed on how close this is. I will just note before I open it up, if you watch the prediction markets, so these are the markets where people can actually make bets on who they think will win. It's sort of shifted to Trump, and even the polling has sort of shifted. So Harris had a huge bump over the summer and early fall, and now it's back to, I mean, we're a 50-50 country. So let me stop there. Tara, Johnny, Addison, anything to add here before we keep moving on and look at some more data at the national level, including the Senate and the House?
I'm good,
No,
sir.
but we should all be filling out our 270 to win map to see how we do with our predictions. So highly recommend we all do one of those.
It's a cool website. If you've never been there, just Google 270 to win. So you'll see I pulled a few different graphics from that, and it's very interactive. And as Tara said, you can fill out your own sort of battle card, if you will. So if you're into that, I highly recommend, like Tara said. All right, so let's keep moving on. So obviously, elections have consequences. Don't need to reiterate, right? So, what would a Trump presidency look like? What would a Harris presidency look like? Not only for their own initiatives, what does that mean for the U.S. Department of Education? You know, historically, education for Trump and frankly for Harris has not been a top tier issue. But to the extent that they've talked about it, and with Trump, we've got some, indications from when he was president before. School choice is going to be, a major effort. Now, what can they do at the federal level on school choice is a whole nother question, but you can expect a lot of talk about school choice if Trump is elected. He's going to clearly, work to reverse the Biden, particularly the cultural issues, Title IX, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to go through that long litany, as well as a higher ed policy. So all of the student loan forgiveness, you can see a Trump administration seeking to reverse a lot of that or stop that. Now, what about Harris? Frankly, more of the same. I think there's going to be more of a, I think, continuance of existing sort of education policy. That being said, the Biden administration really dealt a lot with the pandemic. They haven't been as active on K-12 policy, but where I do think you'll continue to see are a focus on some of these Title IX, the diversity and equity and inclusion issues, more on higher ed. And on K-12, the big question is ESEA or ESSA. Will either president look to start to reauthorize that law? I'm not holding my breath on that, but that law was passed in 2015, and I know there was a pandemic in between, but it's starting to sound more and more like folks in DC are thinking about it, not necessarily taking action, but thinking about it. What the two share, though, and I think it's worth spending a minute on where folks share sort of policy focus. CTE, workforce, huge focus for the current administration. It will be for either of the future presidential administrations, as well as early childhood education. So there still is some bipartisanship when it comes to policy, but not really on K-12 or higher ed, more on CTE and workforce and early childhood. And then lastly, on the U.S. Department of Ed, I think there's some talk that Cardona could continue as Secretary of Ed under Vice President Harris if she is elected as president. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think there's a lot of fatigue that sets in. I think it'll be time for her to select a new leader. There's not a lot of talk about who that might be yet. So it's a little bit of a we don't know. If it's Trump, there's some speculation that at least one former state chief, actually a couple former state chiefs, and Johnny, you can jump in on this. There's been some scuttlebutt. I don't know anything. I'm not saying I know anything, but a Ryan Walters from Oklahoma, a Cade Brumley from Louisiana have been names that have been bandied about. But who knows, right? Like, it's hard to say who that will be and who will be in charge. I will say, whoever becomes the new Secretary of Education, it's not just the secretary, it's the deputy secretary, it's the assistant secretaries, it's a whole bunch of political appointees, which means that at the federal level, there will not be a lot of new policy making, no matter who gets elected in 6 days, because they have to get appointed, they have to get through the Senate confirmation process, they have to get their people in place. So, from a U.S. Department of Education perspective, I would expect not a lot of movement or activity. They'll get grants out. There's some work that needs to be done on the current fiscal year. But in terms of new policies, new regulations, it'll be pretty much status quo. Under Trump, I think it'll take longer because I think it'll take longer for him to staff up the agency. But it could take a long time for Harris as well because she'll have to get all of her appointees through the Senate, which I'll talk about in a minute and is likely to flip from Democratic control to Republican control. Before I move on, Johnny, Tara, Addison, anything to add?
Doug, I would ask, would you say that, social media and sort of student personal information protection, I mean, in my mind, that's also a priority of both, obviously not as high as ECE or CTE, but I feel like that's something we've heard on both sides of the aisle also.
Yeah, so Congress has been more active on that front than the U.S. Department of Ed, but I do think you will continue to see that as a focus, particularly with the rise of AI and what does that imply about student data privacy. So I would expect so, but not much in the next year. Johnny, you were going to say something.
Yeah, Doug, I think this is going to be, regardless of who wins, will be a very interesting and a very different transition. If you think about the transition, the 2016 election, we were still in the process of implementing ESSA. Had the ink really hadn't dried yet on everything pertaining to ESSA, and so you switch administrations, you switch party control there, and there was some lag time with that. Then you go to the next transition after the 2020 election, and the focus was dealing with the pandemic. So we don't have any new legislation that passed. That it was bipartisan in 2015. So it was a very unique situation then. We don't see that coming anytime soon. And we're not dealing with a pandemic. So it will be a normal, but not normal for recent history, right? I mean, it will be a situation where they will be trying to find their footing of what they want to do, what they want to be as an agency. The other thing I will say is the conversation around, getting rid of the Department of Education. 99.9% confident that that's not going to happen if Trump wins. But here's what I think could happen. And you saw a bit of it in the last Trump administration, where you saw trying to move some of the levers of power out of DC. Could there be a situation where some of the tasks that are part of the Department of Education's mission right now, get relocated, get moved out, get farmed out, to the states? Some consolidation of programs. So will there be any changes to IES or NCES? Changes to some of the things that affect, SEAs, like the regional education laboratories and the comprehensive centers that have very similar, similar missions. And so I think you might see some piecemeal approach and dismantling at the edges of the department, but not a wholesale change. Also think you need to look at and Doug will talk about the Senate and the confirmation process. I think either side is going to have a tough time finding people who can get confirmed. That's going to be important, finding the political appointees that have to go through confirmation that can get through confirmation. And that's probably going to knock some folks out of the running just because they don't want to go through that process.
Yep.
So
Johnny, great segue here. Because you touched on other things I was going to touch on. So I'm going to reinforce some
sorry.
things. No, that's all good. I'm going to reinforce, and I might slightly disagree on a couple of things. So it was a perfect segue. So let's talk about the Senate and the House. So right now, the Senate is democratically controlled. Everybody So I think the one certain thing I feel about this election is that the Senate will flip to Republican control. And that's largely a function of the Democrats are defending a lot more seats than the Republicans. And a lot of those seats are in states that Trump had previously won. And with a 50-50 electorate and some of the candidates, like the Republican candidates who are running this time around, are generally stronger candidates. So it's going to be close. And you can see at the top there, right now, folks are generally seeing about a 51 to 52 Republican majority. Key thing to keep, well, couple of things. One, the new committee chair of the Senate Help Committee would be Senator Cassidy, Republican from Louisiana, who's currently, he is the, ranking member. So right now it's chaired by Bernie Sanders of Vermont. So that would flip. That would mean, pretty massive differences in terms of policy focus. But the key thing to keep in mind is sort of some of your points, Johnny. It's not a governing majority in the true sense of the word. So yes, will Republicans be in control? Will they set the agenda? Yes. Do you still need 60 votes to get anything done? Yes. So Republicans will not have sort of that majority to overcome, filibusters and holds on legislation. And you can bet your last dollar that Patty Murray is not going to let the Department of Ed get eliminated along with a lot of other Democrats. Like, it's just not going to happen. That is policy that's way beyond what the Republicans could reasonably achieve in the Senate. And by the way, Johnny, just to slightly disagree, some of the things you talked about in terms of the shifting role of the U.S. Department of Education, it all would have to clear the Senate, and I don't think it's going to, right? Like the best I see in a divided government, when I say divided, I mean when the Senate is so closely divided, is really status quo. So will we see a reauthorization of the Education Sciences Reform Act, which created IES? Possibly. Will it be a big shift in policy? No. Will we see huge upticks in funding? Most likely not. When you have divided government or this close of a government, you get sort of status quo or very centrist sort of approaches. So you don't get huge cuts or huge increases. And so what about the House? Pretty much too close to call. And you can see on the top line there, it's 206 to 206 projected. And there's 23 races out of 435 that are going to determine control. So it's that close of a margin. And if the Democrats take control, because it's currently under the Republican control, they're going to have such a slim majority that it's going to be hard for them to even govern in the House. So if it does flip the Democratic control, Bobby Scott is the most likely chairman. He's from Virginia. He's been on the committee for a long, long time. Very focused on diversity and equity issues. And he's a known quantity in the sense of we kind of know where his focus will be. So back to my earlier points, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, there's a chance it may move in a lame duck session this year. If that doesn't happen, I think it'll move next year. ESRA is the Education Sciences Reform Act. I would think you would see some early childhood education action. I don't know if it will get done. And then again, the question mark around ESSA. What I do think you may see in the next 2 years around ESSA is Congress, both on the Senate and the House, will start to hold some hearings, sort of understanding how things are going, what's working, what maybe is a challenge post pandemic. So I do think we're going to hear more ESSA talk, but it's not going to get done. So the net, particularly if one or both of the houses is a different party than the president and the administration, again, divided government means not a lot gets done at the federal level. So more status quo, more level funding, not huge swings in policy, and frankly, not much policy at all. So it will be interesting to see. And then, Johnny, to your last point, who can actually get appointed through the Senate process will determine how quickly the department can start to move on any initiatives that they might want to try to do from a regulatory standpoint. All right, I'm going to turn it over now, Johnny, and have you start us in on the governors and where we're at. So take it away.
All right. Well, just one point, Doug, if you quickly go back to that last slide, because there is one point there that I want to make regarding the Senate control. One of the biggest programs in education, as Addison can attest, is the school lunch program. And that's not a Department of Education program. That's a U.S. Department of Ag program. So that, those issues often go through the Senate Ag Committee, and the ranking member currently is Senator John Bozeman from Arkansas. He would likely become the chair of the Ag Committee, and I know from conversations with him, he is very open to conversations of expanding to the National School Lunch Program. But he also has been very clear that he doesn't think it should be expanded to cover all students, because he uses the example of his own grandkids. He says, my grandkids go to public school. They don't need this. They don't need free lunches. We can buy their lunches. So I think you're going to see, maybe some conversation about how does the school lunch program change? But some advocates that say, let's just feed all the kids, that would be unlikely to come about with a split. To Doug's point about, you're not going to see drastic changes in policy or funding, even on things that they agree on, like school lunches. Okay, let's talk about our governor's overview. It's a light year for governor races in the country. So you look and you won't see a lot of changing at the State House. 11 total races. Right now, there is one toss-up that is New Hampshire. You have Governor Sununu has been a very popular governor, is term limited. And so that race is going to be watched to see what happens, because New Hampshire, as soon as this presidential election ends, the next one will likely begin. And guess where it begins? It begins in New Hampshire. So we'll see how that shakes out. But we expect governors in 8 states just because of term limits or folks moving on to other things. And except in Utah and Montana and Vermont, Governor Scott, Governor Cox, who is working hand in hand with Governor Polis now from Colorado with the National Governors Association. You see a lot of joint efforts with Governor Cox and Governor Polis to try to shape the public dynamic of public intercourse and conversation, to try to, I think that's something to watch over the next couple of years, is to see how those two governors, how successful they might be. And, what is the impact of governor? I mean, every governor has education policy. You have some states that even that are not on the ballot, or governors' races aren't on the ballot, where governors are really strong in pushing a school choice agenda. Others that are pushing a very, more funding for education agenda. And then as the states change governors, there's a good chance in some of these states that appoint the state chief, you're going to see potential changes. I'll use Indiana as an example. Indiana has a very active state chief with Katie Jenner, good friend of mine. But that position is appointed by the governor, and with the governor's race there, you have the former state chief, McCormick, running as a Democrat in that race. And after being in Indianapolis last week, it's not a foregone conclusion that the Republican is going to win. Senator Braun is the Republican candidate, and it's a little closer than I think we expected at this point, as indicated by the lighter red. I think that means leans Republican, right, Doug? So that one is one to watch. As far as the blue states, obviously Washington, we don't expect a change there. North Carolina is one to watch because of the closeness of the presidential race and what impact that will have. The Republican candidate has had some issues, some bad PR in the last month or so. But how will the dynamic of the presidential race, how will the dynamic of the hurricane and the flooding and all those things that happened in Western North Carolina, how will that impact that race? Which then has an impact on our next slide. We'll talk about the state chiefs. There's also, we don't have it on the slide, but something that is very worth watching are the elected state board positions. There are a number of states that have elected positions up on the ballot now, and in those states, the state board does carry a lot of influence. And so that's something that we'll be watching. Utah, for one, has a number of seats up in their state board, and that can have a strong influence on not just the path that the department takes, but sometimes the legislature. Will legislatures pass laws that then are left to the state boards of education to implement? We've seen states where, because the State Department or the state board was not in support of school choice, the legislature has put the management of certain school choice programs under a different agency that's better, closer tied to the governor. So that's something that we really should watch as well. As far as our state chiefs, there are 4 races. A few states in the country elect their state chief. Kirsten Baszler, North Dakota, is the longest serving. She was first elected in 2012. She survived a primary challenge and expect that she will win that race in North Dakota. Chris Reichel also, while these are nonpartisan races, that we expect that Chris will win that as well. And then in Montana and in North Carolina, you'll have a new chief. Elsie Arnson, who was the state chief in Montana, she ran for Congress, lost in the primary, but there will be a new chief there. And in North Carolina, the Republican primary gave us a surprise when the incumbent Catherine Truitt lost. The Republican candidate there is facing a former superintendent. That's really too close to call. The limited polling I've seen there shows that could go either way. And we're obviously interested in how that will carry on. So I'll stop there to see if anybody has comments on governors or state chief races.
Johnny, I'll just say one point on the new governors. Even if it's of the same party, if we're not expecting necessarily, a huge shift, there's a couple of states that we talked about where could be a party shift, which would signal, a pretty significant change in policy direction potentially. But even when a new governor is elected, they're all going to be giving their state of state speeches at the beginning of next year, which will be the signal of what they want to focus on, what they're going to bring to the state legislatures. And so, even if it's more kind of continuity than change, just the fact that there was an election that they are being reelected is a time for them to sort of lean in and make their views known of either what they want to accomplish in their next term, or the battles that they're planning on fighting. So just for folks to keep an eye on, even the ones where we don't think there's going to be a massive sort of sea change, they will be signaling in the very near future what they want to be focused on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Let's see. And I think Tara is going to
That's right.
pick up here.
Absolutely. So this year we've obviously got a few education ballot measures around the country. And, I'm going to take these out of order. I think Colorado, Kentucky, Nebraska are interesting to me because they're sort of grouped together as the school choice amendments. So, in Colorado, it's not a specific program, but it is very explicit language that says each K through 12 child has the right to school choice. In Kentucky, they don't actively have a school choice program because their constitution doesn't allow for money to go to non-public education. And so this would change that. And then in Nebraska, this one is different. It's a veto referendum to either overturn or uphold an education scholarship program that would provide scholarships to students to go to private schools. So they're each kind of on their own school choice journey. And it's interesting to me to kind of group those together. And then two others that, I'll point out the one in Florida since I'm here. This is a reversal of a 1998 vote, which basically made all school board races nonpartisan. Now, 26 years later, Florida has become much more partisan. Our governor is very interested in making the school board races partisan. And so, perhaps if this passes, we may see a total reversal of that, and we would have partisan races for local school boards. So, and then the other one in Massachusetts, it's the repeal of the MCAS. And I think obviously this one it's just a reflection of how the view on assessments is changing and kind of the value and how we are assessing students. So that one's interesting to me. And then Johnny, if you want to talk quickly about Arkansas, since that's your home state.
Yeah, in Arkansas, when our lottery amendment passed in 2008, the language was very specific that those funds would be used for scholarships in degree programs. So 2-year, 4-year degree programs. But, as you probably realize, there has been a lot of shift in the last decade and a half of focus of, hey, we need more people who are trained in these technical programs, who can get a technical certificate and get out in the workforce. So the legislature referred this, and it simply changes the language in the lottery amendment to allow for funding of VOTEC programs. Still student scholarships. It doesn't go directly to the programs, but it goes to the students that could then choose these VOTEC, these technical certificate programs. So again, back to Doug's point early, about the focus of CTE, that is being reflected in the ballot initiative there. Kentucky, would just add to Tara's comments about Kentucky. They don't even fund their charter schools. That is one of the things that Kentucky has, advocates for charters have said holds Kentucky back with respect to just charter school choice, is because the state cannot fund charter schools under their current amendment or current constitutional language. So it will be interesting to see, and you look at all the choice ballot measures and the spending, the anti-choice, those who protect the traditional school system are afraid that choice will take funding away from traditional public schools. They have outspent the advocates for school choice probably around 2-to-1, if not more. So interesting dynamic to see how those will shake out on Tuesday.
Absolutely. And then, at present, as you see here, we've got 23 Republican trifectas, 17 Democratic trifectas, and then 10 states with divided government. I think in the states.
And Tara, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're not talking about horse racing in the sense of putting money on a trifecta. You might want to just explain what that is.
Yeah. Thank you. So in these states, the Senate, the House, and the legislature, or excuse me, and the governor's office are all held by one majority party. So in Florida, for example, we've got supermajority in the House. I think that our House is veto proof. We're near there in our Senate, and we've got a Republican governor. So, see kind of how that's divided across the country. I think to me, one of the things that's interesting about trifecta governments is you can see that policy moves can move a lot faster, and frankly can be a lot more aggressive in how far to the right or to the left that the legislature and the governor want to be. But I also think, the context there is that those relationships do evolve, and just because everyone's the same majority party does not mean that everyone's getting along at any point. And I think from a government affairs lobbying perspective, that's why having relationships in both parties and in every branch is so critical, because you have to know what's going on and you have to know who is getting along with who. So that's really important. And then I also think the nuance of, just as I pointed out, just because those states have a Republican trifecta or a Democratic trifecta doesn't always mean that in education things are hunky-dory. So in Oklahoma, right, you've got Ryan Walters, who we mentioned before as perhaps a candidate for Secretary of Education. That trifecta has also worked against him. He kind of came in as the golden child, and I think you've got a lot of the legislature that's very frustrated with him at this point. And then in Texas, this one's interesting to me because typically Texas, Florida, we're all very aligned on school choice. But in Texas, the rural legislature, they have concerns about school choice because they really want to understand what's in it for their communities. And so that's going to be coming up again next cycle. And, Strategos is definitely watching to see how that turns out. But I think that's a really interesting nuance, specifically in Texas, that I love to watch play out.
And Tara, just a question to you as we sort of think about this of where there are trifectas and which ones may change, as you think about the governor's races in this context, North Carolina is one that really jumps out at me where, that's a state that, is divided, could have a new governor. And so one way to start to put some of this together is, the governor's race, who's going to be elected as state chief? Do they have divided government or unified government in terms of party control? And so as you start to layer these, you can get a richer sense of sort of the dynamics in a given state.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tara. All right. Addison, you're up.
Yes, sir. And great job, Tara and team. Now we transition to what do we look at the landscape overview from school district implications. As Johnny talked about, and Tara and also Doug talked about, new leadership brings new priorities, and it could be tug of war from the left side to the right side. And openly, we got to find a way where we're really focusing on children, being child-centric in this space. When we look at the overview, when you look at the number of school districts across this nation, I think now we're at the part where we're around 13,500 school districts across this nation, serving close to 50 million students in this space in public education from pre-K through 12th grade. And we have a number of states in those elements that really drive the work with having over 8,000 charter schools with 3.7 million students. And that number continues to grow and could potentially grow if different leadership transitions in. But we have to understand, when we look at the overarching map in this particular slide, we see that there's a variation in district spending, right? And in this, there's significant adjustments made that's leading disparities along of educational resources and opportunities. And as we look at this, the national average we see is probably somewhere around $17,000 per student. And this really could mask the disparities between states, because you look at some of the highest spending states like New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, they spend over $20,000 per student. But then also you have states on the lower side, such as Utah, Idaho, Arizona, that could be expending less than below $10,000 per student as they try to serve in the K-12 world. The political implications of looking at this type of spending is that you have an equity issue and you have an adequate issue related to looking at the disparities in per pupil spending, raising concern equity in and having adequate resources. Education could be torn apart depending on which new leader will transition in. However, we have to understand that students in lower spending states may have access to fewer resources, impacting their educational opportunities and also their outcomes. And we know that as this pre-election offering, as Doug talked about, it could move from having a lot of federal interaction versus state and local interaction as well. So understanding that as the next couple of days, as we figure out and close and identify the new leadership as they move in, we have to find somewhat of a balance between state and local funding to be able to influence local levels. And that comes with different tax policies, as Johnny knows, and also school choice, which could lead to a number and has led to a number of debates related to voucher systems, and also making certain that drilled down and taken away from per pupil spending in the current states and along the way. But it also has district implications, looking at funding from a resource allocation per state, also looking at the differences between property tax revenues and also program funding related to offering a wide range of programs and services, such as extracurricular activities, advanced accelerated courses, higher CTE educational opportunities, and also being able to properly serve students with special needs and so forth. And also there could be torn between what class size looks like as we jump into school districts. Key things to think about as leaders as we transition into this space is the cost of living. This is really considered the context of the cost of living in each state. Higher spending states may have higher cost of living related to which really increase things like teacher salary and faculties, and also student needs, making certain that we have the right proportions of needs to be able to serve students with special education needs, and also ELL, which are English learning language students, to make sure that they have adequate leveraging as they move forward. We also have to know that when we look at school districts, school size really truly matters. Larger school districts really have the buy power and the ability to negotiate bulk prices, whether that be textbooks, whether that be technology, or any type of ancillary services. And they operate more efficiently from a centralized location versus from a differentiation of a decentralized opportunity, which may not be able to control their return on academic investment or their ROI every day. Smaller districts really face a lot of challenges related to higher pupil costs due to fixed expenses, in which have to be spread over fewer number of students within these particular spaces. So know that there may be a differential between interacting with large districts and smaller districts in the sports that come with those, because different titles, different roles, different responsibilities. In smaller district, the superintendent may be the HR lead, may be the one that's doing the purchasing, whereas large districts, they have a bigger range of C-level personnel and number two and number threes with decision maker, economic development buyers, and also influencers to be able to drive the work. The one thing we look at is that when we look at changes in leadership over the last couple of years, since the pandemic, we've seen tremendous movement and leadership, and that wave has really echoed across the country, not only in state superintendents and commissioners of education, but also of district leaders as well. And as you have this big change in leadership, this will cause a great ripple in spending and decision making. And that that when we look at this, that will have spending pauses and potential shifts, because new leaders bring new priorities. And when you have new superintendents, new commissioners, new presidencies, new outlooks, new board takeovers, you really have to look at the pauses that they will reevaluate the existing budget and spending priorities, which can lead to really shifts in funding and priorities and readjustments of the current contracts, selectively abandoned contracts or adding new contracts. There also may be delayed decisions. What delayed decisions, or what is the money, determining what the majority money is being spent on, how they look at new curriculum adoptions, large scale technology purchases or implementations, how they focus on safety, and then also being able to put in new budget alignments, which is going to take some of the old focus apart and bring it into realignment to the new focus, which shifts forward. So I say that for us, we just got to be mindful of that cautious approach that may take place. And as new leaders come in, you got to understand individuals that have been there for so long don't want to make these big impact rational decisions without having the new leader actively engaged and involved. So be able to look at how you can continue to build relationships for stability and avoid them from making any haste decisions as they move forward. And when you look at the overall, in the last couple of years, last 3 years, the top 100 school districts in the nations, we see that 28% of those leaders have changed. And if you look at 23-24 school year, of the top 500 largest school district in the nation, 20% have changed leaders compared to the year prior, which is really looking at 14%. So these significant changes could have major impact as you move forward. And just know that we've got to be in the forefront of building those relationships and making certain we pay attention to what market's asking us to do to be able to serve.
And just Addison, thank you for all of that. I'm just going to add a couple of points to tack on to the end here. One is, in the news business, there's an old saying that if it bleeds, it leads. Basically, the worse the story, the more attention it tends to get. And I think we've been a little bit subject to that in the education funding space, where the sky is falling stories, Esser fiscal cliff stories, they tend to paint a much bleaker picture than necessary. Certainly, there's an impact. I like to say the Esser cliff is more of a slope than a cliff that we're going to fall off and die when we fall off. Like the fiscal environment, at least in 24, yes, in a couple of states and in some districts it was challenging, but as a whole, funding sort of stayed solid. And in fact, when you look at per pupil spending by state, it's just continued to increase year over year. Some of the data that we see is that the spending is slowing in terms of its rate of change. But if you wipe out all of the ESSER dollars, there's still a lot of money left in the system. And in fact, I just heard this morning, some new economic data that the national economy appears to be staying fairly steady and strong. And again, I know there are individual differences, but as we think about sort of life after ESSER, it is going to be more challenging, but there are dollars in the system. It's not like the Great Recession when the stimulus dollars ran out. People were just in all kinds of difficult circumstances, and there certainly will be instances of that now. But I don't believe, and Addison, agree or disagree, I don't believe it's as severe as what some of the headlines might lead you to believe.
No, sir, I think you're spot on. I mean, listen, I do think for the first time we got properly funded in education. I think we missed the opportunity as state leaders, as district leaders, to come together in the first 2 years to identify what worked, what didn't, what we needed to have systemically, and leverage our local delegations and federal delegators to be able to help us have that systemic funding. However, before COVID, we had a lot of money, and after the pandemic, we still have a lot of money, to your point. I think that as a former superintendent running the 7th largest district in the nation, and also Clay, if there was an opportunity for me to identify an upgrade and solution, or to address a need with a particular product, solution, or delivery service, I would take that on, regardless of what time of the year it may be. I think for us as companies trying to penetrate, stay within organizations or companies, or try to break into it, we've got to show how we're different. We've got to show that we align to their strategic plan, not only from a Band-Aid perspective, but a systemic perspective. And at the same token, if we've been in there for 5 years, we've been in there for 4 years, we've got to show organizational impact. And if we're not, we've got to customize and adjust to the needs of the district, and we got to evolve. The same playbook, the same plan just won't be enough. And as Doug transitions to slides, I think this slide is so important when you look at a survey that was conducted, a non-scientific survey that by chiefs, state legislators, district leaders, and other former educators. you see that there's been a new line of priorities as school districts are starting to find proactive solutions and priorities. I think student safety, when you have the horrific event that happened in Georgia and also in Parkland, that becomes the greatest priority that we're doubling down on. And also we see what's going on with social media and the community. We're trying to make this a psychologically safe place every single day where kids can learn and become and reach their full potential. But I also see that there's major opportunities that that you see school districts are navigating through to be able to look to have a brighter future. And then how do they actively activate, science of reading? I think the science of math is coming on board. How do we create policies and procedures for AI? How can AI help us from an administrative perspective to take on different roles and tasks? And how can it be able to leak into look at personalized learning and tailored instruction that really allows us to use data and technology to tailor our individual needs and have flexible pathways and choices for students to learn? And I also think that we get to a point where we see that career technology, building stackable credentials. We're having accelerated programs in CTE career opportunities has allowed them to be successful. And, the achievement gap's never going away as we look to have equity and inclusion, and technology integration seems to be faster in this light as we move forward. And then also looking at teacher well-being. And one thing that I've seen that I think for me could be one of the top priorities, more school districts are focused on tier one instruction and how to build capacity of teachers, not only through pedagogy, but content wise, and bringing in providers and solutions that helps us accelerate that part. And it's not only for teachers, it's for peers, bringing peers to pros to teachers, and also bringing and creating a longer, stronger bench of educators and helping leaders such as assistant principals and principals get stronger in his or her practice. And the same thing with building future leaders and the cabinet level. So a lot of community engagement, a lot of teacher, recruitment efforts and student engagement efforts to be able to be successful in this process. And one thing we learned from the pandemic, pre-pandemic, we had a really good job in school districts related to getting students to school and attendance. The pandemic allowed greater flexibility, and now we're getting back to a part where we are doubling down to find proactive solutions to get kids in school, actively engaged and helping them, discover full and endless possibilities.
Yeah, thanks, Addison. Johnny, Tara, please jump in, weigh in, in terms of what you're seeing with issues and trends, and, using maybe some of these issues as a guidepost more than a actual directional marker.
Yeah, I mean, I think Addison ended with talking about even the chronic absenteeism issue. That's something we're talking about a ton here in Florida. And I think that obviously alongside the teacher shortage issue and the teacher absenteeism issue, like people are not in schools, and that's even just becoming a challenge. But yeah, I think the chronic absenteeism point, Addison, is spot on.
Yeah. And one thing that I'll throw in there we didn't talk about, because chronic absenteeism, I mean, I think there's a deeper conversation there. I think I think COVID really put a dent, it ripped a bit of the fabric of our society from the standpoint of our expectations. We've created in the US the expectation of you get up, you go to school. And we've had challenges with that. I mean, I just think that a lot of what you see today, the animosity, some of the issues that percolate in school board meetings with outrage. It's what is the outrage of the week or of the month? I mean, a lot of those things, I think, I would trace them back to the pandemic. And we are still dealing with the aftermath of that. Districts are still trying to be creative, but I think sometimes they pick solutions that may be creative but aren't very helpful, like the 4-day week. There are states where more districts are experimenting with 4-day weeks. I don't think before the pandemic we would have ever heard of the number of districts going there. I think in Arkansas, we probably are approaching 20% of our districts that are having 4-day weeks. Those are things that are going to continue and have an impact on spending, have an impact on student outcomes, have an impact on communities.
Johnny, I think that's great. One thing that I think school districts have to do, and the 4-day week is not only there to be able to help with the shortage of educators, make this more attractive, but I think it's an opportunity for capacity building, right? Using day 5 to, the 5th day to be able to build capacity, have professional development, but also being able to maybe to have community engagement for students who are in the secondary level, the transition and you be a part of any kind of internships in their career to have that double exposure and get potential, credentials in those spaces. So love that idea.
All right. Well, we're almost at time. Just sort of wrapping up here with some thoughts. Clearly, there's a lot happening at all levels, and the upcoming elections will have tremendous consequences. And we're paying close attention, as I know you are, to sort of where all of this is going to land. And as I said at the start, it may take a little time before we really even know who some of the winners are and how their policies may play out. But the red versus blue, man, it's real and it's not going away. We are a 50-50 country, and how those states approach education policy, there are some commonalities, but there are also some significant differences. We talked about the change versus continuity. How much change is going on? Change is both a risk and an opportunity. A risk if you've got something going that you need to sort of protect and keep going, an opportunity because new things may be coming online, new leaders, new ideas. Um, the one thing that I continue to find pretty interesting when we talk about some of the funding is where's the funding going? And that's a conversation that we'd be happy to have, separate, because we could spend a whole hour on that. But a lot of the states that are enacting choice policies, new funding or just existing funding is being sort of that whole formula, how money is distributed to whom and for what, there's some real changes going on even in states, right, that don't have massive choice programs. There is a lot of discussion about how do we better flow these dollars to districts, to schools, and in states with choice, to families and students. So a lot happening. We're on top of it, as you can see from the last hour. um, what can you all do? What should we be looking at? We are establishing the new status quo. The work that you're doing, the work that we're doing is shaping what this future state will be. The pandemic sort of really accelerated, I think, a lot of conversations that were already underway in terms of, our existing system was not good enough for enough students. Addison talked about achievement gaps and just the number of students who were having access to 21st century skills or opportunities. There is still going to be a lot of change, and we are in the midst of establishing what that's going to be looking like. We talked about the legislative and the executive activity. We talked about these issues at the bottom. So, stay informed. We're here to help, and we dig into this stuff and live and breathe it daily. But Johnny, Addison, Tara, anything to add just as folks sort of take all this in, and any advice, any guideposts for them to be, looking at over the next, week, 2 weeks, end of the year into next year?
I think that you're spot on, everyone. I appreciate your time. I think that, from our side of it, we'll stand ready to be strategists to be able to assist, but just pay attention to what matters and what's going on related to educational policies, priorities, laws, directions, and try to stay true to your core values, but at the same token, being able to make small adjustments to be able to continue to serve children.
Yep. Just, I think this is a good time for even myself to remind myself and my friends of an old saying that Haley Barbour from Mississippi used a lot. He said, in politics, it's never as bad as it seems. It's never as good as it seems. So depending on which side you're on, who you're leaning for, just know that on November, the week after, on Wednesday morning, we may not know who won, but the Republic will still endure, and we will still be here helping, advocating for education, for the good things that are happening, for good things you were doing, and we appreciate the partnerships.
And if there are things
Absolutely.
that we didn't address, please just reach out to us and, we'll happily answer any questions.
100%. Thanks, Tara. I was going to say that too. So that's a great way to end. You've been, thanks all for joining us. And this was recorded. The slides will be available. We'll send this out after the fact. But if you have specific questions, want to dive in anywhere, you know where to reach us. So have a great rest of your day and go vote.